As I've mentioned in numerous videos at this point, by the end of the 90s, the Resident Evil brand had become incredibly valuable, which ultimately made it a very attractive franchise for upcoming console publishers to try to gain exclusive rights to. And of all the companies that you might have expected to offer Capcom the best deal, Nintendo ended up securing the rights to not only bring the existing 4 mainline entries to their new GameCube, but also for multiple upcoming Resident Evil games to be developed exclusively for the system. And the first in this new lineup of GameCube exclusive RE titles would be a full-blown remake of the very game that started it all, Resident Evil. Series producer and director of the original game, Shinji Mikami, felt that even in the few short years since its release, its graphics and gameplay did not age well and left the game already feeling pretty dated. So he pitched the idea of a remake to the higher-ups at Capcom, and they very quickly gave him the green light, allowing development of this project to start at the beginning of 2001. From here, the game would go through a rapid development cycle, and was released to the world in March of 2002. Those of you who saw my video on the original game a couple months back will already know that Resident Evil is a game that I hold very dearly for a variety of reasons, but most importantly, because it was the game that got me into gaming as a whole when I was a kid. So does the remake manage to recreate everything that made the original so special, or would it ultimately fall short of pleasing longtime fans like myself? Well, you all saw the title and thumbnail on the way in, so let's just get into it. But before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 8th in a series of videos where I'm playing and reviewing every game in the Resident Evil franchise. You don't have to have seen the rest of the videos in order to enjoy this one, but I would highly recommend that you've seen my video on the original if you're not already familiar with that game, just so that you can get a good idea of what the game was like and the design philosophy behind it before learning about the remake. So for those of you that are interested in that or any other video in the series, I'll have the full playlist in the description below. But with that out of the way, Resident Evil is a survival horror game developed and published by Capcom for the GameCube in 2002. As I mentioned before, it's a remake of the original Resident Evil for the PS1, and it not only shares the same director as the original, but also a large number of developers and staff who worked on RE1 years prior. So contrary to the majority of remakes that we get in the gaming space, this was essentially the original team going back to polish up and improve upon their original work, which is honestly really cool when you think about it. Oh, and there are a few different ways to abbreviate or refer to the RE1 remake floating around out there, but one that I feel like I should mention and clarify right off the bat is that of R-Remake, or Remake depending on how you pronounce it. You take the abbreviation of the series RE and you just capitalize those letters in the word remake. It's clever, and I'm going to be using it a lot throughout the video, so I hope you guys like it as much as I do because you're gonna hear it a lot. Anyway, I think it's only natural to start talking about a remake by covering the game's presentation, and man, the Resident Evil remake is a seriously good-looking game. Unlike what we saw in Code Veronica, Remake has shifted back to using pre-rendered backgrounds just like the classic trilogy did, and this allowed for the team to make what is easily one of the best-looking games ever released on the GameCube. The jump in horsepower from the PS1 allowed the developers to not only export their backgrounds in higher resolutions, but also put way more detail into the few 3D models that the system would actually be rendering on screen. A lot of the backgrounds have actually now shifted from still images to video files as well, allowing for some really cool effects like lightning coming through the windows from the storm outside, or the flickering and motion of light from a fireplace. There are also some backgrounds that now have high quality reflections in things like particularly shiny floors or puddles, which is just another thing that would have blown players' minds back in the early 2000s. I mean, just look at these backgrounds, these character models, just take it all in for a second. And then remember that this is a console exclusive game that released in early 2002. Now, you can occasionally see things like your character's feet clipping through the ground a little bit while moving on sloped surfaces, or their feet not aligning with staircases properly. But those are really the only nitpicks I have when it comes to the visuals here. Oh, and they also gave Jill some, breast physics? I don't really know why the Capcom devs wanted those things to be moving as much as they are, even when she's just slowly walking around, but they are, so yeah. The last thing to mention with the presentation is that the Spencer Mansion now has a much darker atmosphere than it did in the original, and while I love the original's portrayal of the mansion, I just can't help but love the remake so much more. The original Spencer Mansion had this kind of uncanny feeling to it. Everything in the mansion was so bright, which you wouldn't think would work well for a horror game, but the fact that everything was so clean and well kept left things just feeling creepy. It felt like the mansion was still very much lived in, and yet there were no people to be found, aside from the living dead, of course. But the remake Spencer Mansion feels immediately uncomfortable. It has a much more abandoned and weathered feel to it, making it feel like whoever did live here just up and left the place years before we stumbled upon it. Which then only makes the fact that it's become a house of horrors filled with monsters and puzzles even more mysterious. And the remake's fantastic sound design only makes the atmosphere of the mansion even better. So all of these things together ultimately make the remake's interpretation of the mansion the one that I picture when thinking of Resident Evil 1, which is pretty incredible considering that I grew up playing the original and only played the remake years later. Getting into the gameplay side of things, players once again get to choose between playing the game as Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine. The differences between them have been pretty much carried over exactly as they were in the original, with Chris still having a larger amount of health than Jill, but Jill still having more inventory space and a lockpick that allows her to progress through the mansion more easily. And I want to throw in here, just for those of you who have never played the game before and might become interested in doing so because of this video, the difficulty selection screen is kind of confusing in this game. When you start up a new game, you'll be presented with this screen. The 3 difficulties on offer here are described to the player as being comparable to taking a walk, going on a hike, or climbing a mountain. Now, if you're like most gamers out there, you'll likely assume that these are describing the easy, normal, and hard difficulties respectively, right? Well, you'd be wrong in this case. What these are actually describing are the very easy, and normal difficulties. The hard mode in Remake is only unlocked after you've completed your first playthrough, so if you want to get the developer's intended experience, you'll actually want to select the one that compares it to climbing a mountain. Which is a fairly apt description, because the Resident Evil Remake is easily one of the most difficult games in the entire franchise. Not the hardest, mind you, that's probably a discussion between Code Veronica and the next game we're going to cover in the series, but Remake is definitely a top 3 contender if you ask me. This game on normal difficulty is so fine-tuned to ensure that you'll always have enough resources available to deal with the threats that are being thrown at you, but only ever just enough. This ensures that you'll really have to think through everything you do during your playthrough, and leads to an experience that can feel a little overwhelming at times, but is ultimately really satisfying to overcome. There are also some smaller balance changes that have been made here, like the shotgun now having a random chance to pop the zombies' heads, or not pop their heads when aiming up at them. This makes using the shotgun a lot scarier than it usually is in the RE games, as you'll mostly be able to one-shot the zombies like usual, but every few shots, you'll have a zombie just tank it and take a bite out of you anyway. It adds a layer of stress to a weapon that's always made the basic zombies feel pretty trivial, which a lot of people might hate, but I personally kind of love. New players definitely shouldn't be put off by the difficulty here though, as there are also a lot of changes here that make certain parts of the experience easier to get to grips with compared to most classic RE games. Firstly, there's the addition of what the designers called defense items. These are small one-time use items like daggers, stun guns, or grenades that players can find throughout the environment. If you have one of these items on your person when grabbed by an enemy, you can use it to escape from their grasp with the press of a single button, but at the cost of burning that item for the rest of your playthrough. These are a really fun addition, and offer a sort of get-out-of-jail-free card for players who might struggle with the combat mechanics of the classic Resident Evil games. My one gripe with them is that they're stored in their own inventory that's separate from your main one. So you can theoretically be running around with a full 8 items in your inventory while playing as Jill, and still have like 5 defense items in your back pocket. The classic Resident Evil games are all about careful planning, decision making, and putting a lot of thought into every single step of your journey. So in my opinion, the decision to make defense items have their own inventory that doesn't take up from the space of your main one is just a bit too lenient. A lot of players probably won't mind this though, especially those of you who are new to the series. I just personally feel like they could have been a lot more interesting if they required you to give up an inventory slot in order to carry around. Additionally, the pistols in this game have a new critical shot mechanic. Anytime that you shoot a zombie with a handgun in Remake, there's a very small chance that you'll land a critical shot that will pop their heads and kill them instantly. Sometimes you'll get this crit in your first 1 or 2 shots on a zombie, sometimes you'll get it in 7 or 8, and most of the time you just won't get it at all. But when you do get it, it's not only a bit of a dopamine rush knowing that you just saved some ammo, but it's also just really satisfying. It's a simple addition, but a really fun one that offers players a small chance at an easy kill while using some of the worst guns in the game. Then, there's the addition of a progress tracker on the map. When looking at your map in Remake, areas that you've visited will all be highlighted in red if there are still items there that you haven't found, but they'll change to this sort of greenish color when you've cleared out all the items there. This not only adds an easy way to make sure that you're grabbing every single item along your journey, but it also gives new or less experienced players a much easier way to get back on track when they're lost and don't really know where to go next. Now, if you ever get stuck, you just open up your map and go check out the areas that you haven't totally cleared out yet, and eventually you'll find a key item that allows you to make progress again. It's probably the smallest change that I've mentioned so far, but it's definitely one of the most meaningful, regardless of how much experience you have with the series. And finally, we have something that might not seem like a huge change, but it's a really big deal for people like me who have played the original more times than they felt the touch of a woman. The first game's most horrifying monsters both make returns here in the remake, those being the Hunters and the Chimera. These guys weren't just scary because of their designs or the sounds they made or anything like that, but because they were so dangerous and difficult to put down that entering a room with one of them in it would cause you to swiftly shit your pants. Here in the remake though, the shotgun has much more stopping power than it did in the original, which now allows you to put both of these monsters on their ass with a single shot every single time. It was possible to drop them in one shot in the original, but it was based on random chance, and more often than not, both of these guys would just run straight through your first blast and hit you anyway. So now instead of panicking when you're playing as Chris and run into a hunter while only having access to your shotgun, you simply just point the thing their way, pull the trigger, and stunlock them into a nice and easy kill. This might sound like I'm nitpicking something really minor, but those of you who have seen my video on the original game know that I had like 6 different clips in there of myself dying to hunters during my 2 playthroughs for the video. In my 2 playthroughs of Remake for this video though, I don't have a single clip of myself getting hit from a hunter even once. They are seriously that much easier to put down that we went from them being the most dangerous enemies in the original game to me not even taking a single point of damage from them across 2 playthroughs. So while resources are scarce and the game will require a lot more planning from you to complete successfully, some of the most challenging enemies from the original have been turned into total jokes here. Moving on from that mini rant though, along with the Spencer Mansion's reimagined presentation comes some entirely remixed level design. Almost every single room from the original is still present here, and most of them are in the exact same location they always were, but there are also a ton of new additions here. Every area in the game has gotten a ton of additional rooms and areas that never existed in the original, complete with entirely new puzzles, key items, and all the other traditional Resident Evil goodies. They've also added some fun new events to existing areas, like having zombies break through the windows and repopulate certain rooms, much like they did in RE2. And with these changes in layout comes some completely remixed progression. Existing areas have had their key items moved to different places, and the order in which players will be able to unlock new areas is totally different from RE1. This leads to differences like Jill not being able to obtain her signature grenade launcher until much later than usual, or not being able to open up certain early game rooms until your second trip through the mansion. All of these expansions are executed really well here, and manage to add to the game without having a negative side effect on the overall pacing. Well, aside from the cave section. It might just be a personal thing, but I've never really enjoyed the cave portion of the original game. So getting the Lord of the Rings extended cut version of it here is something that I've never been the biggest fan of. Aside from that, the only negative to the level design changes that I can think of is that some of the original game's puzzles have been unnecessarily simplified here. One of the best examples is the box sliding puzzle beneath the guardhouse. It wasn't much of a puzzle in the original, but it took just a little bit of brain power to get through. But here in the remake, the starting position of all the boxes have been shuffled around so that instead of needing to use your brain to figure out how to get them where they need to go, you just need to go through the busy work of taking like 30 seconds a piece to push them through. Like I said, not the biggest deal, just kind of unnecessary. But ultimately, all these level design changes come together to offer an experience that still feels so familiar to longtime fans, but also completely fresh at the same time. New areas, puzzles, and the like aren't the only additions the remake brings to the table though, because it also brings along a ton of new weapons. Most of these are new unlockable weapons that you can earn by completing certain in-game challenges, but there are a couple of noteworthy ones that you'll find on any standard playthrough. The first of these is the new assault shotgun. This is available to both characters during their runs, and is essentially just a shotgun that you can load a few extra shots into that also happens to have a higher critical shot rate, which, to put it more simply, means that you're way more likely to pop a zombie's head with the assault shotgun than with the basic early game shotgun. So it's basically just a straight up upgrade of the original shotgun that you now earn a little later into the game, adding a nice bit of progression that RE1 just didn't have before. But my favorite weapon that the remake adds is the self-defense gun. This is a small 2-shot magnum that you find roughly halfway through the game, but it's impossible to find any additional ammo for it, and one shot has already been fired by the time that you find it. That might sound pretty terrible, but this magnum fires a considerably higher caliber than the classic Colt Python. As a result, the one shot that you get from this thing during your entire playthrough deals roughly 5 times the damage that a shot from your normal magnum would. This makes it an incredibly fun little one-time use pocket rocket to bring along for a boss fight. But I unfortunately only have this one clip of me firing it since I forgot to use it during my Chris playthrough. So, sorry about that. But don't worry though, because I saved the best gameplay addition for last. As you play through the game, you might notice that the bodies of zombies you've already killed will actually stay in place when moving between rooms, unlike all the other classic games up to this point where they would just despawn by now. You'd be forgiven for thinking that this was just a cool little change that was made for the sake of some extra realism, but oh man would you be mistaken. See, every time you kill a zombie here in Remake, an invisible timer starts running in the background. This timer will have a randomized value between 15 and 90 minutes, and once it runs out, so here in the remake, any zombie that you kill is only dead temporarily. These revived zombies are nicknamed Crimson Heads, thanks to the, well, crimson color of their skin after they've been revived. They're much faster, more aggressive, and lethal enemies than your basic zombie, though they can still be put down pretty easily with a quick blow from your assault shotgun. These guys might seem like another overwhelming addition to the game for newer players, but there are plenty of ways to prevent a dead zombie from coming back as a Crimson Head. The first, and by far the simplest way, is to destroy the zombie's head when you kill it for the first time. This can be done using all the usual methods, like popping it with a shotgun, or just getting a lucky crit shot with your pistol. No head means no brain, which of course means no revived zombie. The more complicated method though is by burning the bodies before they manage to come back. This can be done by using some kerosene that's found in certain rooms of the mansion along with a lighter, meaning you do have to carry 2 items in your inventory to do it, but it's more than worth the effort. And actually, to balance out Jill's lockpick a little bit, the designers have actually now made it so that Chris starts the game with a permanent lighter that takes up no inventory space, meaning he only has to carry around the kerosene. It certainly doesn't even bring Chris close to being as strong of a character as Jill, but it's definitely a nice touch for him. Speaking of Jill being the stronger character, her signature grenade launcher of course returns here and can also be used to prevent Crimson Heads from spawning. Simply load in some of the flame rounds that you can find throughout the game, and you'll be killing zombies in one shot while burning their bodies at the exact same time. Sorry, Chris. Maybe you get to be the stronger character next time. Jokes aside though, I love the extra layer of planning and stress that the Crimson Heads bring to the remake, so I think they're a fantastic addition here. To close things out though, let's touch on the story real quick. The story of Resident Evil is basically unchanged here, aside from the addition of the Trevor family. We learn here in the remake that George Trevor is the name of the man who designed the Spencer Mansion for the Umbrella Corporation. and all of the puzzles that we need to solve throughout the game were actually included in the mansion's design as a way to prevent outsiders from stumbling upon Umbrella's secret research here. I personally love stuff like this where the more video gamey elements of a game are given actual believable explanations, so it's a really nice lore addition. But it doesn't end there, because we also learn about his wife Jessica and their daughter Lisa. After the completion of the mansion, George and his family were all captured, with George being locked away inside of the mansion to slowly die of malnourishment, while Jessica and Lisa were both taken in as test subjects for Umbrella. The two of them were both injected with 2 different strains of the progenitor virus, which was the precursor to Umbrella's T-virus. Jessica didn't respond well to her strain of the virus and died soon after injection. Lisa, however, was turned into an indestructible monster that Umbrella would eventually just lock away in the caves beneath the mansion. Throughout the game, you'll run into Lisa Trevor in a handful of different locations and slowly find more notes and documents that flesh out the backstory of both her and her parents. I won't get into it all here, but it's some really sad stuff, and I do enjoy its addition quite a bit, even though it admittedly feels like it has nothing to do with the rest of the game's story and is kind of just there for the sake of being there. The only other real addition to the story is a short note that you can find in the final lab area from William Birkin. In it, he mentions his work on the G-Virus and remarks that he can't wait to see the look on Alexia Ashford's annoying face when she sees it. So it's just a nice little note to remind players that even though RE1's story is very self-contained, there is a larger world out there and more things going on that would be brought up in later games. As for everything else here that's been recreated from the PS1 version, the voice acting and general presentation has improved significantly from the original. Remake easily has the best voice acting in the series up to this point. And while it still feels a little stiff and unnatural at times, we're so close to the point where I can finally just say that it's good and stop bringing it up in every single video. They've also rewritten a lot of the older dialogue that players felt was unnatural or unintentionally funny, but without totally erasing the legacy of some of those goofier lines.
That was a close one. A second late, you would have fit nicely into a sandwich.
The incredible visuals of this game also lead to some really good looking cutscenes, which is awesome for players like me who now get to just sit there and take in how awesome some of their favorite moments from the original now look. Aside from those things and some very slight differences though, the story of RE1 is basically untouched here, which is great. Rather than going through and massively expanding on the story and the lore, the designers left RE1's events feeling like a self-contained story that would inevitably lead to the events of RE2 and beyond. There's a sort of beautiful simplicity to RE1's story compared to everything else in the series, so retaining that feel was absolutely the right decision if you ask me. This video has gotten pretty long at this point though, so let's try to wrap this one up. The Resident Evil Remake is a fantastic game. It faithfully carries over everything that made Resident Evil so special to begin with, while also making a ton of new additions and tweaks that allow the remake to feel like its own unique experience. This isn't one of those remakes that completely replaces or invalidates the existence of the original. Rather, it's one that stands alongside it and simply offers a different take on its presentation and game design. In my opinion, the remake comes out feeling like a much more polished and rich experience. But I still frequently go back to play the original as well, since the two of them both have their own unique qualities that make them worth playing. If you only have the time or the patience to play through one version of RE1, I would definitely recommend that you go with the remake. But if you're willing to play both, I 100% recommend that you play the original and then play the remake. The way that it totally remixes the experience of playing RE1 and intentionally messes with your expectations as a player of the original is incredible, and it's the sort of thing that you really just have to experience for yourself to fully understand. And this, in my opinion, is why the Resident Evil remakes have come to be known as the gold standard that the rest of the industry should be held to. They don't aim to perfectly replicate and replace the original. Instead, they try to offer a fresh take on it for longtime players, while also improving the experience for those hopping in for the first time. And most importantly of all, they do so without delisting the original versions to funnel you into purchasing the new, more expensive one. And alongside establishing all of that, the Resident Evil remake also stands as one of my absolute favorite Resi games to this day. I have a personal top 3 games in the franchise that I just can't pick one definitive favorite out of, and this is the first of those 3 games that we've covered so far in the series. So if you only ever play one of the classic fixed camera Resident Evil titles, I would tell you that this remake is hands down the one you should go for above any of the rest. And at the end of the day, I'm going to give the Resident Evil remake a 9.3. Hey guys, thanks for watching all the way to the end. As always, a huge thank you to our channel members and patrons. YouTube ad revenue isn't exactly known to be the most stable thing in the world, so you guys really do help make series like this one realistically possible. And a quick little plug for those who might not know, I just so happen to stream every single day right here on the channel. We basically just hang out and talk about games the whole time, and we've recently been playing stuff like Resident Evil 2 and the Silent Hill 2 remake. So if that's your thing, feel free to swing by sometime and say hi. Anyway, I'm gonna let you guys go and get back to working on the next video. So thank you all again for watching, I hope you all have a good rest of your day, and I hope to see all of you right back here for the next Resident Evil review.